Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Trollhunters Tales of Arcadia. Okay, so this episode is the episode where Jim formally begins his training, and he has a bit of a rough go of it at first. So, yeah, this is the episode where he formally begins, and we learn a little bit more about the nature of the Troll Hunters. We learn a little bit more about Jim's nature as a human troll hunter, which has interesting implications for the series going forward. But also we learn a little bit more about the whole stigma against Jim, because obviously Jim is the first, as we find out, but it's heavily implied, Jim is the first human troll hunter, the first time anyone has ever actually taken the mantle. So, yeah, obviously that comes with some interesting ramifications for it. But in case the episode opens up where the previous one ended, where Jim and Toby are brought in the Heartstone Trollmarket, and as you can tell by the picture I posted last time, are absolutely floored by how beautiful it is. Like literally they can't stop gawking at it and remarking how beautiful it is. And of course Jim is obviously points out that if this is Jim's home, but if this is actually Blinky and Ar's home, and Blinky and R confirm it is, with Blinky adding that it's the home for all good trolls, and that everybody comes in, lives there, and that trolls come far and wide just to barter there and eat there, and a bunch of other things that are essential for like just troll gatherings and stuff like that. That's essentially what Heartstone Trollmarket is for. But and of course Blinky then proceeds to take them on a tour of the whole of Heartstone Trollmarket. Well, so Toby interestingly demonstrates what Blinky describes as a very troll-like affinity for gemstones and ores. And case in point, Toby is just following behind them all, and he's not only gawking at everything and constantly taking pictures, but he's actually looking around and is able to positively identify pretty much every single gemstone that is just hanging from the ceilings, from the walls, in the caves. He's just able to accurately identify that. Also, although he does stop at one point when he accidentally gets way too up close and personal with a troll, which of course the troll winds up glaring at him for, and he decides to just kind of quietly make his way back to the group and leaves. Meanwhile, Blinky is still giving a tour of Heartstone Trollmarket and explaining to Jim what exactly it is that Heartstone Trollmarket is about, and he goes on to explain how it's a market for troll kind to gather around and buy things, and he goes on to explain that anything that they might need, they can easily find there. And although it's specifically weird, oddball stuff, I should mention, because trolls and humans, obviously, the worlds between the two of them are vastly different. So it's a bunch of oddball stuff that are common for trolls, but things that humans might not necessarily need unless there's special circumstances. But of course they then proceed to go on to explain how he's going on to explain how Heartstone Trollmarket works. They then catch the ire of a certain troll who is revealed a little bit later, but we don't get to see him clearly right away. But in case it's at this point where as they're actually taking pictures and all of those things and gawking at Heartstone Trollmarket, they do start actually gathering a crowd a little bit. Because obviously the humans obviously, as Blinky explains, humans have never been in Heartstone Trollmarket. He goes on to explain that, and sure enough, when several of the trolls question why two humans are suddenly in Heartstone Trollmarket, Arg just defends them and points out their friends, and of course they just continue onward through their merry way. At which point Jim actually runs into some gnomes, and while Jim initially thinks they're cute, because gnomes are really tiny. Gnomes are these little really tiny creatures. You've probably seen them in a couple of different shows. In case in point, show I reviewed previously to this. What is it? Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. One of the monsters from that was a gnome, and And of course, Jim initially thinks they're cute, but then they give him a creepy smile, and they reveal their razor sharp teeth, and they then proceed to try and attack Jim. And Jim quickly realizes he's made a mistake of getting way too up close and personal with them, and at which point Blinky and Art chase them off, calling them vile vermin. At which point, Blinky then proceeds to explain to Jim that trolls are just trolls and gnomes do not like each other very much. The only reason they really keep the gnomes around, other than the fact that they're vermin, scum of the earth, pickpockets, those kinds of things. He goes on to explain how the only reason trolls keep them around is because their groom is picking parasites, mites, and other things off of bigger trolls. So for that reason, they keep them around. But in cases at this point where finally Blinky then proceeds to show them the piece de resistance, the Heartstone, which is the cornerstone and center of the entire Heartstone Trollmarket. It is a massive gemstone that is just situated in the middle of Heartstone Trollmarket, and as Blinky goes on to explain, the Heartstone is quite literally that. It is both their source of light and sustenance, and just about everything else that a troll needs to survive. Pointing out that without it, they would essentially crumble to dust and turn to stone, and since that's not good, they obviously need to keep around a Heartstone to just kind of constantly keep alive and stay alive and a whole bunch of other things. But in case, as Blinky and is finishing up the tour and is about ready to take Jim to get ready to start his training. It's at this point where the trolls then proceed to gather around, and they quickly realize they've gathered around, and they don't really understand why there's a human down in the depths with them. They are very obviously very confused as to why Jim and Toby are just suddenly in Heartstone Trollmarket when a human has never been in Heartstone Trollmarket. Obviously, this is a very big thing, and obviously they gathered quite a bit of a crowd because, they're the first humans ever to be in Heartstone Trollmarket, let alone around a troll ever. So they're obviously very confused and concerned. But and of course, Blinky then proceeds to try and defuse the situation, going on to explain how he tries to explain that Jim is the next Trollhunter, but he's having a difficulty figuring out how to actually put the words. And of course, it's at this point where we actually find out that Jim is one of the troll that Jim spied on, that was actually angry at Jim. He introduces himself as Drawl, who, as we find out, is not particularly happy about the fact that there are humans down in the depths of Heartstone Trollmarket either. And of course, Blinky and does introduce Drawl, which of course he is very confused. But it's at this point where Blinky finally gets the words out that he's trying to explain, and goes on to explain that Jim has actually been chosen to be the Trollhunter, much to everybody's confusion and somewhat fear, because they obviously humans. Then they find it a little bit bizarre that a human has been chosen to be the Trollhunter. But it's at this point. But of course, it's at this point where Jim, after some encouragement from Blinky, does actually summon his armor to demonstrate his abilities as a Trollhunter. And though he kind of whiffs his ability to summon it at first because he gets the incantation wrong because he's put on the spot, he does eventually successfully summon his armor, much to the surprise of everybody, who is a little confused as to how he can possibly be the Trollhunter. And of course, this pisses off Drawl specifically because as he goes on to explain, he's very angry at Jim specifically because as it turns out, he is actually Kanjigar the Courageous' son. And Toby quickly picks up on the fact that that's going to be a problem. At which point Kanjigar proceeds to reveal that he believed that he was going to be the Trollhunter next. He believed that when Kanjigar was dead, he would inherit the Amulet of Daylight and become the next Trollhunter. And for that reason, he's particularly pissed at Jim for taking what he essentially believes to be his inheritance. So and of course he immediately tries to fight Jim and pry the Amulet of Daylight off of him, pointing out that he's not worthy of being a Trollhunter, especially since he's a human. But this only results in both of them being flown back by the resulting energy blast that comes out of the amulet, because it rejects Drawl trying to take it from Jim. But And of course, and Arg winds up catching Jim while Joel just kind of collapses into the crowd. But of course, Arg insists that the amulet chose Jim, and that's not really Joel's choice. But Droll is, of course, still very angry about this, and he then proceeds to put, and all the other trolls are also visibly point out the concern that they're not entirely sure if a human can accurately defend them from their enemies, and some of them even point that out. But Blinky assures them that in time Jim will become an active troll hunter and a great troll hunter. But Droll points out the very obvious problem, and that obviously Vendel is going to have to hear about this. And we do meet Vendel later, but of course, Blinky just tells Droll that he's more than welcome to go and fetch Vendel if he thinks it'll help. But at which point he thanks Droll for his time. And tells him that it's always a pleasure to see him. At which point he escorts Jim out of there and onto where they're supposed to do their training. And it's at this point where they then proceed to lead Jim and Toby across a massive bridge into a location that Blinky calls the Hero's Forge. And of course Toby stops and tries to take a picture of the cave, and Jim decides to mess with him by kind of doing the whole save your life thing where he pretends to shove him and then catches him. So, like a joke. But and of course Toby points out that that's obviously not a good thing. So he points out that he tells Jim never to do that again, essentially. But in any case, after introducing Jim to the Hero's Forge, he then proceeds to point out that this is the place we're going to be seeing a lot going forward, because the Hero's Forge, as we find out, is the training place for all past troll hunters and all future troll hunters. And he goes on to explain how the troll hunters how every troll hunter that comes here comes here to train, and is the place where they are born and made, and is essentially the place where Jim is going to begin his training as well. And of course, it's at this point where Jim is very excited about being able to finally train to become a troll hunter. But and of course, we also find out that this is actually the resting place for a lot of trolls. As we find out, this is the place where all the troll hunters come when they are felled. So. Yeah, case in point, there's just an entire ring of statues around the place, and we do find out later. We find out in this episode that they are in fact troll hunters commemorated for all time at the top of the Hero's Forge, and he does go on to explain that one day Jim will be blessed with a statue up there, but also points out that will most likely be not for a very long time, And of course, it's at this point where Jim is obviously very visibly confused. But also he desummons his armor at one point. I should mention, I didn't bring that up, but there is an explanation for that about how he's able to summon and desummon his armor in here as well. Whereas as he's entering the Hero's Forge and as he's getting accustomed to everything, his armor desummons by itself. And it's at this point, and Blakey does explain that it is indeed tied to his emotional state, and that this amulet is kind of getting used to sensing Jim's emotions and figuring out when it's supposed to summon to him, and when it's not. So it senses that Jim is calm and at ease, and the amulet senses that. So for that reason, Jim is able to desummon his armor when he's calmed down. In case once they've explained how the amulet works, and once Blinky has explained about the Hero's Forge and what it is, and he then proceeds to point out that now it's time to actually begin Jim's training, and he then proceeds to tell Arg, Jim and Toby to step back a little bit. And when he points out that they're not nearly back enough, Toby has to step back a little bit more. But then when they don't step back nearly enough, he points out that it's probably clear. At which point he presses a button, and then it's revealed that the Hero's Forge contains a lot of knives and weapons and other things. It's essentially a giant gauntlet. Essentially, it is there to just train troll hunters and make sure that they can actually go and fight. And make sure that they are accurately up to snuff. And Jim, of course, is very much thrown for a loop the first time and just barely dodges out of the way of one of the blades that comes down. He also points out that he probably isn't ready to go leaping into the deep end just yet, and wonders if they can start with some basic training. Blinky concedes and decides to turn all the blades off. But it's at this point where we actually are introduced to Vendel, who reveals that Blinky's full name is actually Blinkus Galactical, and which Blinky points out shame in, pointing out that it's a very dreadful name. But of course, it's at this point where Vendel then proceeds to come in, and he reveals that he wasn't that true to form. Droll did go off to actually fetch Vendel and tell him about the new human Trollhunter they've acquired. And Vendel, of course, walks over and points out that he's more than happy to actually learn more about meet the new Trollhunter. Then introduces himself to Toby, not Jim, because he doesn't realize that Toby isn't actually the Trollhunter. And eventually, after introducing himself very comically for extended period, Jim eventually introduces himself as the Trollhunter and the one he's actually looking for. At which point Vendel goes over to introduce himself and is also a little visibly concerned about whether or not Jim would actually be able to be the Trollhunter. He points out, for the very obvious reasons, that this is the first time a human has ever graced the grounds, and he also points out that it's possible that Jim may not have the aptitude for it. He also points out that, does point out that, as we find out, the amulet has actually made some ill-fated choices in the past. And Vendel is a little concerned that the amulet may have chosen incorrectly this time around. At which point he turns his attention to Blinky and points out that this isn't that he should know all too well that what he's talking about. And when Jim visibly doesn't know what Vendel is talking about, he asks Arg what's going on, and Arg proceeds. And at which point we then are introduced to a character called Unkar the Unfortunate, and I should mention he's one of the Trollhunters featured in the Feld, and they go a little bit deeper into his backstory there, about what happened to him, and it's kind of just a footnote in this episode, but they do go into more detail about him in the Feld. But essentially, what happened with Unkar the Unfortunate was, he was a Trollhunter who inherited the Amulet of Daylight, and Unkar was trained by Blinky. He was trained by Blinky to be the next Trollhunter, and while they only kind of go on about very briefly about what happened to Unkar the Unfortunate, about how he was quite literally torn limb from limb, and case in point, the statue of his arms, one of the arms on his statue falls off. But of course, what the book actually goes into more detail about is that Unkar the Unfortunate was trained by Blinky, and he held the mantle for about 6 hours. Essentially what happened was he went out on his first night patrolling, and immediately decided to go off and go fight Balar. He immediately went off to go fight Balar, fell into a spike trap and got stuck there. And when Balar eventually found him, the aforementioned tearing limb from limb happened. So for that obvious reason, Jim is obviously very concerned about all of that. But of course, it's at this point where Vendel points out that if they are to prove Jim's aptitude, he does proceed to go on to accurately explain what exactly is going on, what exactly is happening with Jim. The way he decides to do this is by summoning an item called the Screwed Sky, pointing out that it will test his aptitude. Blinky objects, pointing out that Jim has had no formal training whatsoever, and that the Suit Scryer will probably not give him a very accurate reading at this time. Vendel insists that they summon the Suit Scryer, and of course, it's at this point where Blinky ultimately relents and decides to summon the Suit Scryer, which, as we find out, is this massive machine with a massive spinning thing in the center. And of course, when Jim gets a good look at it, he realizes that the Suit Scryer, there's a very good chance that the Suit Scryer will take his right arm if he sticks it in, and which is exactly what the test actually is. He's supposed to put his arm into the Suit Scryer. And that's how it's supposed to test his aptitude. He puts his arm in and hopefully doesn't lose a limb in the process. And since the Suit Scryer is too tall for Jim to actually get in to actually go and test himself by himself, he asks Toby to give him a leg up so he can actually get in, and Toby is obviously doesn't want to do it, but he points out that Jim that he'll be more than happy to help out Jim, but in case Toby then proceeds to stoop down as a footstool for Jim so that Jim can climb up and put his arm in the suit scar, and of course, Jim, is in a little bit of visible pain when the suit scar clamps down on his arm, but then it eventually lets him go, and tells him that he's fine, and tells him that, and he realizes that he's fine and that he hasn't lost a limb. But when Jim asks for the reading that the suit scar gave, Vendel points out that the suit scar was inconclusive. And when Jim asks him to clarify on that, pointing out that that's a little bit odd and he doesn't fully understand what inconclusive means, Vendel merely explains that since Jim is the first human troll hunter, there is no record of a human being in the system. So for that reason, the suit scar can't pass judgment on him because it has literally no data to work with. So unfortunately, Vendel leaves and tells him that hopefully in time, Jim will be able to prove himself and won't be dead before the suit scar can pass judgment. At which point he leaves. But in cases at this point where Vendel then after Vendel leaves, Jim quickly has to start thinking through some things as well. And adding to that, we also find out what gum-gums actually means in troll speak. When they're actually explaining some things as well. Because while Jim is doing his training, they go on to explain as he's doing his training and getting ready to prepare himself to become the next troll hunter. Blinky does explain what Gum Gum actually means, and in large part because Jim doesn't think it's a very intimidating name for an enemy troll to have, and he goes on to explain that Gum Gum essentially means in troll speak, bringer of horrible afflictions and evil pain. So yeah, very bad. But in case after hearing all that and after learning all this, Jim then proceeds to decide to go home and think about it a little bit. And of course, Toby points out that obviously Jim has inherited a very big responsibility, and he points that out to Jim, pointing out that obviously Jim has to now figure out how to become the next troll hunter and figure out how to actually do some things with as the troll hunter, and obviously he's going to have to continue his training. But Jim is obviously very hesitant because, as he points out, one of his predecessors got killed on his first night, and Jim is not very much looking forward to repeating that mistake. So for that very reason, he goes on to explain that he's obviously going to need to kind of think about it a little bit. At which point Jim and Toby realize that Barbara is home, and Jim and Toby decides to just make up huge excuse about how he was jumped by the Russian mafia and they had to fend them off with their bare hands. And although Jim goes for the much more believable excuse that Toby's bike got hit by a car, but Toby himself was nowhere near the accident and was completely fine. And when Jim concludes that will absolutely work, he then proceeds to go back home while Jim goes to explain to his mother. And he goes inside, and he proceeds to go inside, and is then visibly confused when he sees that Mr. Strickler is there. And of course, Mr. Strickler reveals that actually he's there. That the reason he's there is because he was trying to make a meeting with Jim's mother for the longest time, which of course Jim neglected to do in the first episode. He neglected to give Barbara his number for obvious reasons, but also for that reason, he then proceeds to go on that because he's met her and points out that she's a very charming woman. He also proceeds to go on and tell her about all the extracurricular activities that Jim is involved in. Although the way he phrases a lot of his sentences in this scene, it's not subtle that he's also talking about Jim being the next troll hunter. And since we know that Strickler knows that. Jim doesn't know that Strickler knows, but Strickler doesn't really make it very subtle. The way he words his sentences in the scene very much implies that he knows, but Jim doesn't realize that yet. He just kind of is like, "What are you talking about?" But of course, it's at this point where he goes on to explain that Jim has actually gotten the part as Romeo and Juliet. Much to Jim's surprise, because he didn't think he actually got the part, but after explaining that after Jim's marvelous performance while trying out for the role, that's obviously Jim was a shoo-in to actually get the part of Romeo and Juliet. But also he goes on to explain that in addition to that, Jim has also joined the chess club, which of course Barbara is visibly surprised by, because she points out that she didn't even know that Jim knew how to play chess. And does point out her support of her son for that. Pointing out that obviously she very much supports the idea that he's able to play chess. But of course, Principal Strickler does point out that he's worried. He's also worried that Jim is pointing out to spreading himself too thin. Pointing out that much like Atlas bearing the weight of the world on his shoulders, he points out that Jim might very well be straining himself too thin, and is a little worried that he may be taking too many extracurricular activities, and hopes he'll be able to juggle all those balls at once. At which point Barbara then offers to pour Strickler a cup of coffee, but Strickler points out that he wasn't really hoping to overstay his welcome. He points out that he was actually just about to leave. He was just there to talk about some things. Then proceeds to leave and thanks Barbara for her hospitality, and also not so subtly flirts with her by kissing her hand, and then proceeds to walk out the door and tells Jim that he'll see him at school. At which point Strickler then proceeds to walk outside the house, and he sees Bilar just standing outside of Jim's house. And he then proceeds to tell off Bilar, telling him that he shouldn't be there. With Bilar pointing out the very obvious problem about how he should just have the amulet of daylight in his hands right now. He should have razed Jim's house to the ground, and tells him that, and points out that he should have just had the amulet already, so he can free his father. But as Strickler points out, the last time he did that, it almost exposed their entire operation. So for that reason, they're going to need to use a little bit more finesse, especially since Jim is the first human troll hunter, and that offers up a bit of unique challenges in actually acquiring the amulet. So for that reason, he tells Bilar to be patient, and that they'll eventually find a way to take the amulet from him. At which point Jim and Barbara then proceed to have a conversation inside the house, where Barbara is obviously very, very concerned about Jim taking on so many different extracurricular activities, and she does point that out to him, pointing out that she's worried about his grades slipping, and points out that if his grades even slip, that she's going to ask him to have to take some time off from them. But of course, Jim points out that he has no problem with doing that, and but she also specifies that specifically her meal times for him, and she points out, but he then proceeds to point out that's not going to be a problem, that he likes taking care of her. At which point they have a very honest conversation about Jim's dad, where he points out that when he was old enough to ask what happened to Dad, he points out that it's just that she said it was just going to be the two of them, and that they would need to look after each other. And he points out that that's exactly what he's doing. He's taking care of her. So, at which point she decides to accept that explanation, and at which point they wish each other a good night, and Jim goes upstairs. But of course, before that, she does stop Jim and asks him if he knows anything about who Strickler is, and if he's single or anything like that. And he points out that he doesn't really know any of those answers. But he also briefly sees Bilar in his peripheral vision, and when Strickler then proceeds to push Bilar away from the window rather comically, he then looks out, but then notices that Bilar is gone. So he believes he's just been seeing things, and goes back up and proceeds to go back upstairs. In any case, the next day, it's at this point where Jim proceeds to formally start his training in earnest, where he starts fighting, where it's at this point where Blinky then proceeds to explain the 3 roles of being a troll hunter. As he points out, Jim is going to need to go through his training, and he goes on to explain the 3 rules of being a troll hunter, which the first one, always be afraid. As Blinky goes on to explain, fear keeps you alert and keeps you on your toes, and for that reason, you should always be afraid, because as he points out, bravery is not the absence of fear, it's taking action despite fear. So for that reason, always be afraid is one of the 3 rules for being a troll hunter. But of course, it's at this point where Jim points out that that's obviously a very big explanation. That obviously makes sense. So the next rule is to always finish the fight, because as Blinky explains, a troll hunter should be willing to show no quarter to his enemies, should be willing to fight back and always finish the fight. And of course when Jim needs clarification, it's at this point where Oric and Blinky both point out that they need to be willing to kill. Which of course Toby remarks is a little bit harsh, but Blinky then responds that it's just the world they live in. And finally, he points out number 3, which is when in doubt, kick them in the grog nuts. And of course, Jim doesn't fully understand what a grog nut is, so Blinky explains to him by using a saw blade to almost castrate Jim. So and of course it just comes out of the arena and almost castrates Jim. And of course, Jim fully understands completely, but also can't help but find it funny that 1/3 of being a troll hunter is to kick someone in the balls. Which he points that out and finds that that's obviously very funny. But it's at this point where Droll proceeds to walk into the stadium, and he walks into the Hero's Forge, and remarks that he has decided to show up and give Jim a sparring and be Jim's sparring partner. And of course, Blinky objects, pointing out that Jim has only just begun his training. He is in no position to face off against Droll, who is a seasoned combatant and fighter. And he proceeds to point out that Droll, of course, that obviously Jim's not going to be in any position to fight. But then Vendel appears in the viewer box for the Hero's Forge, and tells him that he'll allow it, and that he requested it by special permission to do it. And since Vendel asked him to do it, he decides to back down and is like, okay, I will let this thing happen. And he does. He goes on to let Droll and Jim fight. And what we'll quickly find out is that true to form, Droll quickly becomes apparent that Droll is way too much for Jim to handle at this time. And of course Jim also points out before the fight, before they actually begin, that he's actually never been in a fight before, which also further complicates things. And of course Blinky goes on to explain that is confused because when he finds out that Jim has never gotten into a single fight in his life. He then proceeds to give Jim a pep talk before the speech about how it only will take one hit and he'll be changed forever. And of course Jim takes any confidence to go fight Droll, and while he does seem to fight back against Droll briefly in large part because as he explains, some of his techniques that he used against Bilar were actually his chef skills, which just came in reflexively to help him. What we quickly can find out is that Droll is just basically Sonic the Hedgehog but a troll. So yeah, he essentially just runs around the entire arena like a boulder, and very quickly and swiftly defeats Jim before grabbing Jim and proceeding to get ready to drop him over the edge of the arena. And of course Droll decides to let Jim live, because he points out that he had waited his father's entire lifetime to actually take the mantle of Trollhunter away from his after his father lost it. And points out that he can wait a little bit longer for Jim to finally kick the bucket before he properly takes the role of Trollhunter. At which point he drops Jim back in the arena and tells him that that it doesn't matter, that he hopes for his sake that he'll stay down, and then proceeds to leave. At which point Jim then proceeds to have a very big question about whether or not he should actually be the Trollhunter and should actually start fighting off against trolls. And he quickly finds out that obviously Droll, it seems like obviously he realizes now that he may not be cut out to be the Trollhunter, and proceeds to leave after his embarrassing defeat. But of course Blinky points out that he has to stay and finish his training, pointing out that it's only his first fight, and that he will absolutely need to actually learn training if he wishes to become a great troll hunter one day. But Jim points out that they weren't really paying attention, that he was pretty much just feeling embarrassment, and he doesn't want to be an embarrassment to them anymore. So for that reason, he hands them the Amulet of Daylight, and tells them that they should really consider finding a new guy to fill the Trollhunter. And but Blinky reveals that that's actually not possible, because pointing out that regardless of whether or not Jim wants to be the Trollhunter, the Amulet is now mystically bonded to him and will pretty much find him wherever he goes. Case in point, Blinky then proceeds to let the Amulet go, and just kind of flies back to Jim, who grabs it. But And of course, insists that this is a mantle that Jim is not going to be able to refuse. But Jim tells him that, so says, watch him. At which point he drops the amulet back into Blinky's hands, and he then proceeds to leave Heartstone Trollmarket. But sure enough, case in point, true to Blinky's words, when Jim arrives back at the house, the amulet is there waiting for him in his bag. And Jim quickly realizes that he quickly decides that he's that since the amulet is being stubborn, he's going to get rid of it in pretty much any way, shape, or form that he can. Case in point, he eventually drops it. In the trash bin. But when that doesn't work, he covers it with books to keep it in the trash bin. And this just winds up being a recurring bit for the next several minutes of the episode, where every time Jim throws away the amulet, it comes back to him, regardless of how he tries to get rid of it. Like he tries to bat it away with a baseball bat, it just comes back to him. And while he's brushing his teeth, it's in the medicine cabinet while he's brushing his teeth. And a couple of other similar scenarios like that. But of course, eventually Jim gets kind of fed up with it and decides that fine, if it's going to be around for him forever, then he might as well get used to it. But it's at this point where he proceeds to go to his Romeo and Juliet practices, and Miss Janeth quickly realizes that Jim is a little bit out of it because they're currently reciting the lines, and Jim is kind of just not really doing very well at it, and she picks up on that. But of course, he points out that he's got it. He's just trying to get it through all of it. And Claire does notice that he seems to be struggling a little bit. So she asks him if everything's okay. Even pointing out that even though they don't know each other very well, she's more than willing to listen to him. But and of course Jim then proceeds to go on to point out that he's just thinking through some things in his head, and he's not really sure what to do with his time anymore. So she proceeds to go on to explain how that's perfectly fine, and also proceeds to explain that they're going to be spending a lot of time with each other in the meantime, and also points out that if regardless of what's going to happen, he's going to need to work through what's going on in his head so he can play a bit more of a convincing Romeo. At which point Miss Janeth interrupts their conversation and they go back to practicing. Meanwhile, after thinking about a little bit over practice, he then proceeds to leave the school, and it's at this point where Steve Palchuk stops him. And of course, Steve, as we find out, Jim missed his quote unquote appointment with Steve, where where Jim was supposed to get his ass kicked. But of course, Toby points out that he missed it because he was currently getting his ass kicked by somebody else, and tells him to take a number. But of course, it's at this point where Steve tells him to butt out. And of course, at this point where he tells Jim that if he made an appointment with him, he expects Jim to keep it, and he points out that at this point he has two options: either he can grovel in front of him, or get his ass beat. And of course, it's at this point where they start gathering a crowd, including Claire, who shows up, and Jim initially takes a knee and decides to actually wuss out, which Steve is very surprised by. But when he realizes that Claire is watching him, he decides to actually stand his ground against Steve and tells him that he's not and that's what's at this point where they actually start fighting. And of course Jim's for the most part at the early part of this fight essentially just starts dodging Steve's flailing fists, and Steve just constantly punches him or tries to punch him, but winds up hitting something else instead, including the locker several times, and winds up missing. But he eventually does not wind up knocking Jim down and tells him to stay down. But Jim then proceeds to see the amulet in his bag, and now more motivated, he then proceeds to stand up and stand his ground and tells Steve that that's the best he's got. At which point Steve then proceeds to get ready to actually punch Jim in the face, telling him that's a good thing that his mom's a nurse. But it's of course at this point where Jim then reiterates what Blinky said to him about one punch and he'll be changed forever. And sure enough, he then proceeds to nail Steve right in the jaw, which knocks Steve flat on his ass and knocks out one of his teeth. And it's at this point where Jim tells him that she's the doctor, actually. Just adding insult to injury. At which point everybody kind of celebrates the fact that Jim has successfully knocked Steve flat on his ass. And a couple of people actually trample over Steve to celebrate Jim's newfound victory over him. And of course, it's at this point where we get a cutaway to Heartstone Trollmarket, where we find out Droll is currently in the tavern, and he's currently gloating about the fact that he bested the Trollhunter. He's also making up, embellishing it a little bit to just kind of make himself look bigger than he really is. And in actuality, it was a very one-sided fight. But Jim, but of course he's just boasting about his victory over the Trollhunter. And of course Blinky and Arg are just sitting at the bar, not necessarily with him, but at a table nearby. And of course, they do point out it's unfortunate that Jim won't come back, and also point out that it's unfortunate as to how Jim has essentially. They point out that they're just hoping that Jim will eventually be that Jim would have just gotten one good clean hit in, pointing out that one function he'll be changed forever. But it's at this point as Droll is boasting, pointing out that he'd be more than happy to fight the, as he puts it, the flesh sack. Any pretty much any day of the week, and hopes that he'll be a good punching bag. It's at this point where Jim walks into the bar, grabs Droll's mug, and tells him to name the time and place, and that he'll be there. At which point, Arg and Blinky quickly realize that Jim did in fact get a clean hit in, not against Droll, but against someone else that they didn't actually see him fight. And of course, it's at this point where Jim now has a newfound sense of confidence, because he's now won a fight, and he now knows that he can probably take Droll and could actually win a fight against someone. So yeah, that's essentially what the episode is. He finds out how to face off against someone, and he's now got a newfound sense of confidence. In large part because he knocks Steve flat out of his ass. And to be fair, at this point in the story, Steve kind of deserves it, but he gets a lot better later in the series. I will admit that, but yeah, at this point in the story, Steve very much deserved to get his ass kicked. So yeah, Jim definitely did the school a bit of a favor by kind of setting him straight a little bit. But in any case, that's gonna do it for my review of Trollhunters. We're going to be seeing him fight Droll in earnest next time, so that's gonna be fun. But yeah, in any case, that's gonna do it for my review of Trollhunters. What you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well. It's only a couple bucks a month. It does really help me out, and you guys get access to a bunch of cool perks that are my way of saying thanks. So be sure to check those out. Link is down in the description. And in any case, yeah, be sure to go check out my Twitch. I stream Saturdays and Sundays. Please go check those out. Be sure to go and also, since you're already here, be sure to go and check out the videos linked in the end screen as well. The top video is the most recent video. It may or may not be this video. Whereas the bottom video is the video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me, and I have no idea where it's going to send you, probably to more Trollhunters that I've reviewed. So yeah, for the time being, yeah, I have no idea where it'll send you, but in any case, yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!